All right, I'll try and project a little better. Thank you for inviting me out. I have been almost to Muskegon several times. I have a child who goes to Blue Lake in the summer, so I've gotten almost to Muskegon. I didn't realize until today just how close I'd gotten. But it's very nice to be here, especially this winter. I imagine not many people come to Muskegon in January. In fact, my students thought I was crazy to come in here, but I reminded them that this was a mild winter, so I was not living dangerously by driving out. And you live in a beautiful town, so thank you for letting me have a chance to see it. I also want to thank you for coming out to a lecture on a Thursday night when it's cold. I don't think we would get half as many people coming to a lecture, although I will say I find that human sacrifice is weirdly popular as a talk. One meets some strange people when working on human sacrifice. So there is a handout, and this is very low tech. Right? And I'm going to ruin the surprise for you right off the bat. Let me just say at the beginning that there is no doubt that the Romans, despite being relatively enlightened and sophisticated rulers of the Mediterranean basin for about 1,000 years, there is no doubt that the Romans practiced human sacrifice. What scholars can't agree on, and what even the Romans themselves weren't totally sure about, is how common the practice was, and about how much it was part of the regular Roman religious system. Rituals requiring a human death are well documented throughout the whole first period of Rome's history, when Rome was a republic governed by a senate and not by an emperor, and that's roughly the years 509 to 44 BC. And these rituals continue on into the empire from the period of the death of Julius Caesar until Rome was sacked by the Goths in 476. There were several rituals that the Romans observed that required a human life be taken. One of the most famous was the duel between the priest of the goddess Diana, and the priest is often called the king of the grove, and his potential successor. The story goes that the priest was always a runaway slave. If the slave escaped from his master and made his way to the goddess's sanctuary on the shore of Lake Nemi, he could challenge the current priest to a fight to the death. If the runaway killed the priest, he could take over the priest's job, living in service of the goddess until he himself died at the hands of a challenger. Another ritual that required the death of a human being was the expiation of a certain kind of prodigy. A prodigy in Roman terms is not a 4-year-old who can play Mozart. A prodigy in Roman terms is something that violates the natural order, like a maidservant giving birth to a snake, birds flying backwards, statues sweating blood. The Romans claimed all these things happened. My favorite one is meat falling from the sky, all right, or a strike of lightning hitting a building. So the gods sent prodigies to the Romans to let the Romans know that the gods were angry with them. And then the Romans needed to perform certain rituals to make the gods happy. Sometimes the gods let their anger be known by allowing the birth of a hermaphrodite, a child with both male and female sex characteristics. When the Romans learned of such a birth, they ordered their priests to drown the child in the sea, and then a chorus of virgins would chant a special hymn as they paraded through the city. Two other forms of ritual murder, which is the term I'm going to use for all these different rituals together, two other forms of ritual murder involved burying people alive. The most common form of live interment was when the Romans would force a priestess of the goddess Vestal to enter an underground chamber that was then sealed shut. This was the punishment if the priestess, who was supposed to remain a virgin, had been caught having an affair. In a similar fashion, the Romans, on a few occasions, always moments of great crisis, buried alive 2 pairs of foreigners, Gauls and Greeks, 1 man and 1 woman each. Now, all the rituals I've just described are forms of what I'm going to call ritual murder. They require the death of a human being. But are they all human sacrifice? Some of you are probably wondering what's the difference, because we all, including scholars who specialize in the field, use the term human sacrifice pretty loosely to cover any religiously motivated killing of a human being. But I'm going to restrict how I use that term. I am only using the phrase human sacrifice to refer to a ritual whereby a human life is offered as a gift to the gods. I will use ritual murder to refer to a much wider category of rites. It includes human sacrifice, but also other rites like the drowning of hermaphroditic children, where the human life that is taken is not a gift to the gods. In that particular instance, the taking of the infant's life serves to remove a stain of some sort from the community. It removes pollution a kind of taint from the group as a whole. And what I plan to do this evening is to look at the way Romans talk about these various forms of ritual murder in an effort to uncover what, if any, distinctions the Romans drew among them. I'm going to argue that the Romans do not have any trouble at all with ritual murder. They are, however, bothered by human sacrifice, by offering humans as a gift to the gods, but they still practiced it for a period of several hundred years. My project has implications beyond recovering distinctions in the Roman religious vocabulary. By following the fault lines of Roman cultural categories, it is possible to come to a better understanding of the apparent disjuncture between the way our Roman sources talk about various forms of ritual murder and actual Roman practice. As I've said, ritual murder is not rare among the Romans, but they also have a well-documented abhorrence of human sacrifice. Some scholars, preferring to see the Romans as more enlightened than earlier empires and more humane than their neighbors, have given greater priority to those expressions of disgust, explaining the great number of recorded instances of ritual murder among the Romans as misunderstandings or misrepresentations, or as accurate reports of a habit brought into Roman religion from other foreign religious traditions. Others dismiss the unease and emphasize the frequency of ritual murder in ancient Rome. Now, as illustration of Roman attitudes toward ritual murder, including human sacrifice, I begin with a consideration of the ways that ancient authors, both Romans and the Greeks who observed them, talk about various forms of ritual murder as it was thought to have been practiced by other ethnic groups, by subversive groups and tyrannical individuals with Roman society, and also by the Romans of the distant mythical past. Then we'll take a look at several different forms of ritual murder performed by the Romans within the historical period from about 250 BC onward, and determine which of these rituals the Romans identified as human sacrifice. Thus, it will become clear how widespread the Romans thought their own performance of human sacrifice was. Spoiler alert, the answer is not very. Furthermore, in looking at the language used to describe these events, it becomes clear that by the early empire, roughly the first 2 centuries AD, the Romans made a distinction very close, if not identical to the one I just drew between ritual murder and human sacrifice. They differentiated between acts of offering human victims to the gods, which were unacceptable to them for the most part, and other rituals that entailed human death, which the Romans seem to have observed without hesitation. Now, the topic of human sacrifice appears most frequently in Latin literature in descriptions of foreign peoples. The Romans clearly think human sacrifice is something other groups do, and they use it as a way to highlight how foreign these other peoples are. Whether based in fact or fabricated entirely, accusations of human sacrifice carry a symbolic value, casting the accused as violent and uncivilized, and the accusers, that is the Romans, as enlightened. Accusations of human sacrifice by a foreign group are as old as Latin literature itself. A fragment from the Annals of Ennius, we don't have that poem anymore. When I say a fragment, I mean a little snippet of it that's preserved in some other work that quotes it. So this fragment of the Annals of Ennius, the great poet of the 2nd century BC, this fragment claims that the Carthaginians, a Semitic people living in what is now Tunisia on the north coast of Africa, sacrificed their children. Charges against the Carthaginians are also not rare in the writings of later authors, such as Cicero and Pliny and Silius Italicus. Reports of human sacrifice are also common in accounts of the Gauls, a collection of Celtic tribes who occupied what is now France, Belgium, and Switzerland. Julius Caesar's famous description is worth quoting at length because of its unequivocal use of the language of sacrifice, and this is the first passage on the handout. The whole nation of the Gauls is very much given over to religious matters, and for this reason, those who are afflicted with rather serious illnesses and those who find themselves in battles and dangerous situations either sacrifice men as victims or vow that they will sacrifice them, and they employ druids as officiants at these sacrifices. They do this because they think that unless a human life is given on behalf of a human life, the will of the immortal gods cannot be reconciled. They even have sacrifices of this sort set up for public reasons. Others use figures of enormous size whose limbs of woven osier they fill with living men. And then they set on when these are set on fire, the men surrounded by flame perish. They think that this type of punishment for those caught stealing or thieving or some other offense is most welcome to the gods. But when there's a shortage of criminals, they have recourse to punish the innocent. Now, there's no mistaking Caesar's description of these rituals for anything other than sacrifice. He twice refers to them as such. He uses the Latin word sacrificia, which is where our word sacrifice comes from. And he twice uses a form of the verb immolare, which is the verb par excellence among the Romans for animal sacrifice. Immolare is related to English immolate. Caesar talks of the necessity of a life rendered in order to appease the gods. He also elaborates the point further by describing the men offered to the gods as victims. Then this is another place where English and Latin are very close. Our word victim comes from Latin victima. It's important to note that with regard to both the Carthaginians and the Gauls, it's clear that the Romans aren't making these tales up out of whole cloth. Rather, the Romans are focusing their attention on something they observed. There is ample archaeological and epigraphic, meaning inscriptional evidence for Carthaginian child sacrifice in North Africa and on the islands of Sicily and Sardinia. The Celtic evidence, though less conclusive, is generally taken to demonstrate that human sacrifice by at least some Gallic tribes, even if not a universal Gallic practice. And therefore, in these two cases, the Roman accounts should be read as a combination of ethnographic observation and cultural prejudice. In a third case, there is no evidence that the alleged human sacrifice ever occurred. In the 2nd and early 3rd centuries AD, a rumor circulated that Christians were guilty of human sacrifice. It's not clear how widely the gossip traveled. Though nearly all Christian writers of the period refer to it, there is no direct evidence for it in pagan sources. The earliest pagan reference, if it can be called that, is a vague phrase in the younger Pliny's report to the Emperor Trajan about his interviews with accused Christians in a province that is now in the country of Turkey. He reports that it was in this letter he's basically asking Trajan, what do I do with them? I can't get them to stop being Christians, so what do I do? He says it's the Christians' custom to go their separate ways after meeting for prayers and to come back together later in the day for a harmless communal meal. Pliny's attention to the meal and his description of it as harmless may suggest an awareness of charges made against Christians. Accusations of human sacrifice and cannibalism often go together. The charges levied by the Romans, or at least allegedly levied by the Romans, were turned back on them by Christian apologists. Representative of such accusations is Tertullian's assertion, and this is number 2 on the handout, that in that most religious city of the pious descendants of Aeneas there is a certain Jupiter whom they wash with human blood at his own gains. He refers to the cult of Jupiter Latiaris, a deity worshipped from the earliest times by the Romans and their neighbors at a sanctuary on a mountain that sits a few kilometers southeast of Rome. The highly polemical nature of the source makes Tertullian's claim suspect. Indeed, all the other evidence for the use of human blood in the worship of Jupiter Latiaris comes from hostile passages in late Christian sources. The only victim that we know from more reliable sources that was offered to Jupiter Latiaris is a bull. As in the case of Carthaginian and Gallic practice, but even more pressingly, claims of Christian and pagan performance of human sacrifice had symbolic value. They're just one aspect of the pagan and Christian competition for claims to civility and humanity. By throwing such accusations at one another, Christians and pagans were deploying a trope that had long been a common marker in Roman political and literary invective for depravity, corruption, and vice. For example, rumors of human sacrifice are preserved in accounts of 2 conspiracies against the state, one organized under religious cover during the Republic, the Bacchic cult that was brutally suppressed in 186 BC, and the other, the Catilinarian conspiracy, uncovered by the great orator and statesman Cicero in 63. And in both cases, the rumors are just that. They are rumors. In each case, the accusations of human sacrifice come from much, much later sources, so works written a couple hundred years after the events. And in each of these cases, we have sources that are contemporary to the events themselves, and those sources make no reference to human sacrifice at all. Human sacrifice is also a common element in depictions of tyrannical behavior by Roman leaders. For example, Tarquinius Superbus, the last and most despotic of the early mythical kings of Rome, is said to have reinstituted the archaic practice of human sacrifice to certain domestic deities at a particular festival, and this practice was later supposed to have been abolished after the king was driven out of Rome. The link between tyrannical behavior and human priests persists in accounts from the historical period as well. Amidst growing Roman displeasure with Julius Caesar after his return from Egypt in 46 BC, the historian Cassius Dio says that Caesar handed over some soldiers who had been responsible for starting a riot. Caesar hands them over to the priests of Rome as sacrificial victims. A similar story about the heir of Julius Caesar is reported by Suetonius, who records a tradition that in the aftermath of the fall of Perugia in the civil war between Antonius and the young Octavian who would eventually grow up to be the Emperor Augustus, that in the aftermath of this war, Octavian sacrificed 300 human victims to Julius Caesar, who had recently been made a god by the Roman Senate. I just want to point out that both of those are rumors. We don't think that actually happened. Okay. Another way that Roman authors talk about human sacrifice within their own society is as something that Romans used to do but had long since given up. They contrast their own contemporary enlightened religiosity with an earlier uncivilized state of affairs. For example, each May, the Romans performed a very old observance that had lost its original meaning. No one really knew why. The priests of Rome made a procession around the city and then threw straw bundles off of a bridge into the Tiber River. One popular explanation was that the ritual was a substitute for human sacrifice to Saturn, an old Italic god who came to be known as the father of Jupiter. The story puts the practice into the mythical past. The replacement of human victims with straw bundles was supposed to have been instituted by the hero Hercules when he passed through Italy on his way back to Greece after he captured the cattle of Geryon, which was one of his 12 labors. Other gods were also thought to have once demanded human victims. Vulcan, the god of fire, the Lares, household deities, Veovis, a little-known deity who's related in some way to Jupiter, and Jupiter himself. Human sacrifice was even set into the history of the Roman people at a critical juncture. In Virgil's Aeneid, the great national epic of Rome, a refugee from the Trojan War, the hero Aeneas, comes to Italy with remnants of the Trojan people. They will mingle with the indigenous Latin peoples to form the Roman race. But first, Aeneas has to find himself some allies and fight a war with the Latins. The Arcadian king Evander signs on to Aeneas' cause, and because the king is too old to fight alongside Aeneas himself, he entrusts his young son, named Pallas, to Aeneas in his campaign against the Latins. In a fierce battle in Book 10 of the poem, Pallas is killed by Turnus, the leader of the Latins. Aeneas then goes berserk. He seeks Turnus on the battlefield, cutting down everyone in his path, and when he cannot find Turnus, he takes 8 young men as captives. This is passage 3 on the handout. Here he seized alive 4 young men born at Sulmo, and the same number raised by Ufens, whom he would sacrifice to the infernal shades, and with whose captive blood he would drench the flames of the funeral pyre. Aeneas' sacrificial intentions are clear. In Virgil's use of the word immolare, just as in the passage we saw from Julius Caesar. This element of Virgil's story is, of course, modeled on the scene in Homer's Iliad, where Achilles sacrifices a dozen Trojan young men at the funeral of his companion Patroclus. Both Homer and Virgil use the act of human sacrifice to illustrate the unhinged and uncontrollable anger of their heroes. The prevalence of stories of human sacrifice among the Romans in the mists of the Archaic period has contributed to the interpretation of 3 early Iron Age burials discovered in the Roman Forum as evidence of human sacrifice. Radiocarbon dating puts the burials, known from 3 partial skeletons, 1 male, 1 female, and 1 that we don't know what it was, between about 830 and 780 BC. The archaeologists who uncovered the remains in the year 2000 have argued that these were sacrificial victims, pointing to the location of the remains outside of any known burial areas and the state of the male skeleton. Forensic investigation has determined that he died from a blow to the head with a blunt weapon, and the position of his skeleton suggests that at the time of his death, his hands were bound behind his back and his head was forced backward. Furthermore, the dating of the burials, so close in time to the purported founding of the city of Rome, which is supposed to have happened in the year 753 BC, lends strength to an interpretation of the burials as foundation sacrifices for Rome. But a more convincing explanation, I think, is that these 3 individuals were criminals who had been executed. The Romans had a well-known penchant for using a single location for the same purpose over many centuries, and the skeletons in question were discovered in the area of the Carcer Tullianum, which is the closest thing Rome ever had to a prison. Some convicted criminals, captured enemy leaders, and some Christian martyrs waited in the Carcer Tullianum before being led to execution. By locating the practice so many centuries ago, the Romans distanced themselves from the anger and barbarity that human sacrifice connoted. By repeatedly identifying it as something other groups did, the Romans could see it as foreign to their own habits. In 97 BC, the Romans finally took an official stand against human sacrifice when the Senate outlawed it altogether. The elder Pliny claims this is the Romans' great gift to mankind. This is number 4 on the handout. And it cannot be overestimated how much is owed to the Romans, who did away with those monstrous rites in which it was considered the greatest religious scruple to kill a man, or even indeed the most salubrious thing that he should be eaten. Pliny's obvious pride and the tone of disgust that runs through Roman accounts of Carthaginian and Gallic human sacrifice from the earliest period of Latin literature appear to stand in stark contrast with the frequency at Rome in the historical period of ritual murder, and more specifically rites that the Romans themselves identified as human sacrifice. Rituals that required the death of a human being are relatively rare in the grand scheme of Roman religious life, but performances of those rituals are recorded regularly by our sources. One of the more spectacular examples is the rite of the priest Diana at her sanctuary on the shore of Lake Nemi, which I've already described to you, and which was given central importance in Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough, which is one of the seminal works in the modern anthropological study of ritual. The ritual, in which the incumbent priest of the goddess either fended off a runaway slave who wanted his job or died trying, is clearly of archaic origin, and the Romans continued to observe it into the imperial period. The question remains open as to whether the Romans understood this as human sacrifice or some other form of ritual murder. The 2 most expansive sources, the geographer Strabo, who wrote at about the time of the first Roman Emperor Augustus, and Servius, the late antique grammarian and commentator on the works of Virgil, both link this ritual, the ritual at this sanctuary, to the ritual killing of foreigners thought to have been practiced at the sanctuary of the Greek goddess Artemis at Taurus in Crimea. Although there's little reason to accept that the Roman ritual was an actual historical development of the Taurian ritual, the relationship our sources assume is important for understanding how the Romans may have perceived what happened at Lake Nemi. Strabo does not identify the fight at the sanctuary of Diana as sacrifice or any other particular type of rite. At first glance, Servius doesn't seems to identify both the Taurian and the Orician ritual, the ritual at Lake Nemi, as sacrifice, but his language clouds the issue. And this is number 5 on the handout. The opportunity for fighting, moreover, was established as though a renewal of, or maybe a replacement for, we're not sure what the word means, for the ancient sacrifice. By using Latin quasi, as though, to introduce the comparison, Servius distances It does not necessarily sever the rite from its purported model. More complicated is his use of the Latin word reparationem. It's a very rare word, absent from classical Latin and appearing only in the late antique period, mostly in Christian and legal sources. A reparatio is where we get English reparation. It can be a renewal, and if that's how the term is used here, then Servius indeed identifies the death of the priest of Diana as sacrifice, presumably to Diana herself. However, a reparatio can also be a replacement. Thus, Servius may mean that the Roman ritual was a substitution for the Taurian original, leaving open the possibility that the death of the priest was not a sacrifice. We're on firmer ground, determining how the Romans understood a more widely performed type of ritual murder, and that's the disposal of hermaphrodites. On 14 occasions, between the years 209 and 92 BC, hermaphroditic infants and children were included among the prodigies, which, as we've discussed, are violations of the natural order, that were reported to the Roman Senate. And this was standard procedure. The Senate was Rome's political and religious authority. I, for one, am really glad that the US Senate is not our ultimate religious authority. But the Romans felt differently. And so prodigies observed in Rome itself and elsewhere in Italy would be reported to the Roman Senate, which then determined which of Rome's several groups of public priests would advise the Senate on how to expiate the prodigies and restore equilibrium to Rome's relationship with the gods. Expiation frequently took the form of special offerings, like an extravagant animal sacrifice, dedicating gold vessels or statuary in temples. Some prodigies were expiated by the organization of public festivals also. And in any case, once the prescribed ritual had been performed successfully, the Romans assumed the gods were pleased unless further prodigies appeared. Now, it's rare that we can, using the available evidence, identify a regularized expiatory formula for a particular type of prodigy, but we are able to do just that in the case of hermaphrodites. It appears that a routine method for handling such discoveries was developed by the haruspices, one of the college of priests periodically brought in to instruct the Senate on the proper expiatory measures to be taken. The standardization of expiatory rites for hermaphroditic births probably occurred after the successful expiation in the year 207. The children were placed in a box and drowned at sea. Most important among the other ritual actions taken after the drowning were some offerings made to the goddesses Ceres and Proserpina by matrons of the city, and a procession of a chorus of 27 virgins, and the sacrifice of 2 cows to the goddess Juno. The ritual disposal of hermaphroditic children was not considered by the Romans to be an act of human sacrifice. The drowning of a hermaphrodite is never referred to by any ancient author as a sacrifice, and the child involved is always described as a prodigy and never as a sacrificial victim. The sources also eschew the standard Latin and Greek verbs for to sacrifice when talking about these events, preferring in every instance generic words for kill. The Romans have a lot of words for killing people. It's a very Roman thing to do. Furthermore, the hermaphrodites are always treated as signs of a rupture in the Romans' relationship to the gods. In contrast, expiatory exercises such as the sacrifice of the 2 cows to Juno that followed the discovery of hermaphrodite, those expiatory exercises are intended to repair the rupture. More controversial is the interpretation of the periodic live burial of Vestal virgins, priestesses charged with tending the public hearth in the temple of the goddess Vesta. The most important requirement the Vestals had to meet was that they remain virgins for their 30 years of service. So important was a Vestal's sexual purity to her performance of her duties that once an accusation of sexual transgression surfaced, the accused priestess was immediately removed from her duties. Then there would be an investigation, and then she would be put on trial by the pontificates. These are Rome's most prominent group of public priests. And if convicted, the priestess was carried through the city in a funeral-like procession. She was dressed in funereal clothing, and the covers of the litter on which she rode were tied down so that no one could see her or hear her cries. She was attended by grieving friends and relatives, while the people of the city looked on in mournful silence. And when the procession arrived at a place just inside one of the city gates, the priestess descended a ladder into an underground chamber that had been hollowed out of a small ridge. Bystanders averted her eyes as she climbed down into the cell where she would find certain items set out for her: some oil, water, and milk, a bit of bread, a burning lamp, and a bed. And then the ladder was pulled up and the opening sealed so that no trace remained. The current prevailing interpretation of this practice is that it was human sacrifice. A close examination of the sources, however, reveals that Vestals were not sacrificed, not to Vesta nor to any other god. The full details may not be rehearsed here, though a sketch of the basic outline of the argument will be useful. As in the case of hermaphrodites, unchaste Vestals are never referred to by any ancient author as sacrificial victims, nor is their burial alive ever called a sacrifice. The absence of sacrificial terminology in the case of the Vestals is pointed up when the live interment of a priestess is discussed alongside one particular rite, the only rite performed by the Romans that is explicitly identified as human sacrifice by our ancient sources, and that is the live interment of Gauls and Greeks. This happens twice in the extant literature, and in both instances, our sources are at pains to draw a distinction between the two burials. One of the resources that the Romans had available to them when prodigies were reported was to have the board of 10 men for performing rites consult the Sibylline books, and this was a collection of prophetic texts written in Greek poetic meter. The books were kept in the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the most sacred spot in the whole Roman Empire, on 3 occasions during the Republic, and these are all firmly during the historical period, so there's no reason to chalk any of this up to myth. On 3 occasions, the books ordered the Romans to bury alive pairs of Gauls and Greeks, 1 man and 1 woman each, in the Forum Boarium, which was Rome's cattle market alongside the Tiber River. No satisfactory explanation for the choice of Gauls and Greeks has yet been proposed. Scholars often assume that a ritual response to a crisis in some way relates to the nature of the crisis itself, and while the Romans were frequently at war with both Gauls and Greeks at numerous times over the centuries, it's difficult to pinpoint a moment where they're at war with both of those groups simultaneously, and they certainly aren't at war with both of those groups in any of the years when the Gallic and Greek sacrifice happens. The latter 2 occurrences of the burial of Gauls and Greeks coincided with the discovery and punishment of unchaste Vestal virgins, and it's possible that the earliest instance did too, but the evidence is not totally clear. The coincidence of events in the years 216 and 114 or 113 suggests that the 2 forms of ritual murder were linked. Indeed, they appear at first glance to be identical, live burial in underground chambers, although admittedly within different locations in the city. The Romans, however, seem to have viewed them as having very different meanings, and the distinction is neatly illustrated in the historian Livy's description of the Romans' reaction to their losses at Cannae and Canusium to the Carthaginian general Hannibal in 216. And this is passage number 6 on the handout. In addition to such great disasters, the people were terrified both by other prodigies and because in this year 2 Vestals, Opimia and Floronia, were discovered to have had illicit affairs. One had been killed at the Colline Gate under the earth, as is the custom. The other took her own life. And since this horrible event, which occurred in the midst of so many terrible things, as is wont to happen, was turned into a prodigy, the board of 10 priests was ordered to consult the books. Quintus Fabius Pictor was sent to the oracle at Delphi to ascertain by what prayers and supplications the Romans might placate the gods, and what end there would be to such calamities. Meanwhile, from the Sibylline books, some unusual sacrifices were ordered, among which was one where a Gallic man and woman and a Greek man and woman were sent down alive into an underground room walled with rock, a place that had been tainted before by human victims. Hardly a Roman rite. Now, Livy stresses the traditional nature of the Romans' burial of the one Vestal with the phrase, "as is the custom." And he describes her death in neutral terms. He just says she was killed. In contrast, Livy expressly distances Roman tradition from the second interment, calling it hardly a Roman rite, and identifying it as one of the sacrifices not part of the usual practice ordered by the Sibylline books. And this last phrase makes clear that Livy understands the burial as sacrifice, a point further underlined by his description of the room, the underground room, as a place that had already seen human victims. A similar distinction can be found in Plutarch's Roman Questions, a work intended to elucidate some of Rome's religious peculiarities to a Greek audience. In question 83, Plutarch wonders why, upon hearing that a foreign tribe called the Bletanesi, and we have no idea where those folks lived, that this foreign tribe had sacrificed a man to the gods, the Romans initially planned to punish the leaders of the tribe. But when it was learned that the sacrifice had been done according to custom, the Romans let the leaders go free, only forbidding them to perform such a rite in the future. Plutarch is intrigued by the apparent hypocrisy of the Romans' actions. He notes that the Romans themselves had buried alive pairs of Gauls and Greeks in the Forum Boarium not too many years before the Bletanesi had come to their attention. Now, as is standard practice throughout the Roman questions, Plutarch offers a number of possible explanations, each phrased as a question, is it because? He focuses his attention on the last of these, is it because, which asks whether the reason is that the Romans thought that human sacrifice, and here he again uses the most common Greek verb for sacrificing animals, thuein, that human sacrifice performed because of tradition and custom was wrong, but was acceptable if ordered by the Sibylline books. And he goes on to recount the revelation of 3 unchaste Vestals, whom he says were punished. And now this can only refer to the episode in the years 114 and 113. And disturbed by these events, Plutarch says, the Romans consulted the Sibylline books that in turn ordered the burial of Gauls and Greeks. At first glance, it may appear that Plutarch gives us 2 instances of human sacrifice by the Romans, one of which, Gauls and Greeks, was sparked by the other, the Vestals. In actuality, however, the story of the Vestals intervenes only as background to the burial of the Gauls and Greeks. Plutarch's introductory question had proposed that the role of the Sibylline books made human sacrifice acceptable, and this only pertains to the Gauls and Greeks. Plutarch's choice of words makes clear the distinction between the rites. Although he repeatedly uses the vocabulary of sacrifice for the ritual performed by the Bletanesi and for the burial of the Gauls and Greeks, he doesn't use any of those words for the Vestals. It is at this point that we can begin to see gradation in the acceptability of rituals that required the death of a human being. The ritual murder of individuals whose existence violated the natural order, hermaphroditic children and virgins who aren't virgins anymore, caused little comment. It was customary and unexceptional, and it was not sacrifice. In contrast, the killing of human beings as offerings to the gods as a regular required part of worship was sacrifice, and it was generally unacceptable. It was foreign to Roman practice, or, if we accept what the Romans themselves claimed, it was at least foreign to Roman practice in the historical period. The Romans did not tolerate human sacrifice among the peoples they conquered, forbidding the Bletanesi from performing it, and seriously curtailing the practice, if not actually eliminating it, among the Carthaginians and the Celts. Even so, the Romans were willing, on at least 3 occasions, to offer human victims to their gods. This type of ritual was permissible, but only just barely within the religious tradition, because it was enacted only as an extraordinary or ad hoc response to an exceptional circumstance. It wasn't part of the regular worship, but was ordered, as Plutarch points out, by the Sibylline books. Prophetic texts only consulted when the gods made their anger manifest in the appearance of prodigies. It's impossible to know for certain if the revulsion our sources express when discussing human sacrifice was something the Romans felt in the years that they performed it. Our earliest extant source for human sacrifice at Rome, and that's Livy, wrote nearly a century after the last burial of Gauls and Greeks. Even so, it's unlikely that his eagerness to disown the ritual as part of Roman practice reflects an ethical stance the Romans developed only in the course of the last century BC. As I've noted, Roman disgust for human sacrifice is recorded as early as the beginning of Latin literature. The sources consistently indicate that for the Romans, human sacrifice was always something to be reviled. That said, it is clear that in the beginning of the last century BC, there was some sort of development in the Roman religious mentality. Within 25 years of the last burial of Gauls and Greeks, the Romans had also issued a senatorial decree outlawing human sacrifice and had performed the last recorded drowning of a hermaphroditic child. The live interment of Vestal virgins and the ritual fight for the priesthood of Diana both continued for many centuries, perhaps made acceptable by the underlying assumption that the priestess who forsook her vow of chastity and the slave who chose to run away from his master both had a hand in shaping their own fates. Human sacrifice was a part of Roman religion. It doesn't matter whether, as Livy implies by his phrase, a right hardly Roman, that the Romans believed, or at least told themselves, that they had adopted the rite from a foreign tradition. It does not make the live interment of Gauls and Greeks any less a part of the Roman religion. So to sum up, one could say that in the Roman mind, ritual murder was an acceptable practice and human sacrifice was not, and therefore the Roman people did not perform it, except sometimes. Thank you.